go before us. You sing, no one can stand against. You shine in the shadows. You win every battle. Nothing can stand against the power of our God. Almighty fortress, you go before us. Nothing can stand against the power of our God. You shine in the shadows. You win every battle. Nothing can stand against the power of our God. Almighty fortress, you go before us. Nothing can stand against the power of our God. You shine in the shadows. You win every battle. Nothing can stand against the power of our God. So when I fight, I'll fight on my knees with my hands lifted high. Oh God, the battle belongs to you. And every fear I lay at your feet. I'll sing through the night. Oh God, the battle belongs to you. Oh God, the battle belongs to you.
Good morning. Hey, before you sit down, turn to somebody, just say good morning. Let them know you're glad they're here today, would you? Huh?
I messed up on these 4 words.
Yeah. Hey, super glad to have you here. This is our second week of a series called Heroic Moments. We're spending a couple of weeks in the Old Testament book of Judges, which is a crazy book in the Bible. In many ways, the story we're going to look at today is all about what we just sang, the battles that God fights for us and on behalf of us that we could not deal with on our own. But we're going to get there in a couple of minutes. First of all, let me say thank you to all the jokes I'm already receiving about whether or not I still work here. Our oldest got married a couple weeks ago, and we've just enjoyed a few weeks of just spending time with him and getting used to what is an all-new normal for our lives. But super thrilled to be back with you. Couple of things to let you know about before we go further into the morning. First of all, we have a pretty exciting midweek coming up in August. So we have midweek service here the first Wednesday of every month. So this one, August 2nd, is going to be a combination of indoor-outdoor. It's going to be the first time where we have a service that's going to be partly held outside on our new green space. So what we'll do for that evening, we're going to start inside, and at some point during the middle of the night, we're going to actually move outside for baptism. So it's going to be both outside and it's going to be a baptism midweek for us. So it's going to be an exciting one. If you have never been baptized, if you've thought about it, if it's maybe something you missed last time when we did it, like this is your chance. You can go online, you can sign up, you can go back to the hub before you leave today, you can talk to somebody. If you got questions, they can answer them, or if you even just want to get signed up by talking to a person, please do that and feel free to go out there. But that's going to be August 2nd here and then outside. Baptism's out there, service in here. It's going to be a don't miss midweek for us. Also, this evening, happening here from 4 to 6, our high school and junior high groups are going to be meeting. So we do things a little bit different right now in the summer. They're going to come together for a little bit of time and then break apart. So 4 to 6 is when the whole thing is meeting tonight. And weather permitting, they're also going to be outside utilizing the green space. So if you are a high schooler, junior higher, you have high schoolers, you have junior hires. I've got 2 junior high girls. I will be dropping them off again in a few hours. I'll be back here. So we'd love to have you be a part of that with us. Now, about the green space outside, a few things just to let you know. We're at the place now where the grass has grown, it's usable, and we have a million ideas about how to develop that space and make it even more usable than just lawn. This is Renee. Renee is, everybody say good morning, Renee. Renee is an amazing volunteer here at Kensington that's just everywhere, including really pouring her heart right now into that outdoor space and how we can develop it to make it more usable for us as a community, as well as the community at large around us. So I asked Renee just to come and share a little bit about what we're doing out there and what you can continue to expect to see.
We are so excited about the green space. Today, we are inviting you to come and join us outside, paint a rock, get a popsicle, and walk around the space and see what the visions that we have. There are pictures in the areas of the sections that we're gonna be doing. And please, if you've never walked it, take a chance to walk out there. It's a lot bigger than you think it is. We are also building a team. We are looking for people who are craftspeople, artisans, carpenters, masons for brick and cement work, gardeners, plant enthusiasts, anyone and everyone who wants to get involved. Please sign up out in the hub. We've got a sign-up sheet out there. Let us know what you're interested in, and when we're ready to go there, we will talk to you. We'll let you know what we're doing.
And there's a space you were telling me about that we've got a group here that's actually volunteering to help build. Which part is that?
The children's area, we have one of our men's small groups that wants to build the children's space. So if you are in a small group or a family and you want to just adopt an area, let us know out there when you sign up. Just kind of put down what you're interested in, and we will make sure that you get to be a part of that.
And so you can kind of see, if you go out there today, we're doing a tour, and you're like, a tour, you just walk outside. Well, we'd love to walk you through some of where different parts of it are going to be developed, where like the playscape, the play area for kids is going to be, which if you can picture it, if you've been out there on this side of the building, like on the other side of that wall almost, the kind of ground slopes up. So the idea is to build like a rock climbing wall into the slope of the hill. Anyway, some great ideas that are coming together right now. We would love to kind of walk you through, show you some of it. And like Renee said, this is an all hands on deck. We would love, if you've got some skill or passion for any of that, we would love to have you get involved and put your heart and hands to it as well. When you get out there today, if you've got your kids with you, you're like, what are they going to do? I think Renee just said, we've got rocks that they can paint that will become a part of the whole outdoors. You'll see an area where there's already a bunch of them that have happened. We're going to have ice cream out there. So basically, we're going to get your kids messy and filled with sugar and then send them home. So you're welcome. But anyways, we'd just love to have you stop by, see what we're doing out there. And thank you, Renee, so much for what you're doing. Would you just thank Renee? She has poured so much into this space for us already and continues to do so. All right, here's what I want to do. We're gonna sit in a minute of a song that the whole intent is to try and lean us into where we're going, kind of mentally and emotionally for the morning. So I want to put two lyrics up on screen because I want you to pay attention to these, because these are two lyrics that are going to be sung in a moment. And I just think they, in many ways, they don't just sum up the song. I think in a way they become the undercurrent for really the story, the account that we're going to read out of the book of Judges today, which, by the way, will be in chapter 4. If you got a Bible and you want to beat me there, go ahead and do that before I come back up. But here's the first of the lyrics you're going to hear sung in a minute. I'm out here asking for miracles I don't foresee. Have you ever prayed to God for something that even as you're praying, you're doubting it's going to happen? You're doubting it's going to be healed. You're doubting they're going to come back. You're doubting He cares. You're doubting it's going to change. Maybe you're doubting you're going to change. Like I do this often, where there's things that I'm praying, and even as I'm praying, I'm fighting off the temptation to disbelieve it will even happen. But there's this other lyric that I think sometimes gives indication as to why maybe there's an internal sense that maybe it won't happen. Here's one of the other things that he sings in this song. He says, I've been stuck in my ways and I've been scared to evolve. Sometimes the things that we need God to change, we need Him to change because they are patterns that we feel stuck in ourselves. And sometimes the very patterns in our life that we feel stuck in become the reason that we need God to create change to begin with. That's the entire story we're going to look at today. A moment where in the nation of Israel, they were in desperate need of God to show up in a big way. For God to do a miracle that they couldn't do themselves. And at the same time, afraid that it actually wouldn't happen, doubtful that God would actually come through. And a big part of the reason that they were in the place they needed Him to rescue them from to begin with was because of their reoccurring pattern of being stuck in behavior that was more than anything else the place that they needed His rescue from. So for just a minute, I just want you to listen to the lyrics as Matthias and the team sings this, and just see if God doesn't lean your heart and your mind in before we even get to the text.
I'm not a lost sheep, just feel alone in the flock. I think we all have our doubts. I think mine just caught up. And I've been stuck in my ways. Oh, I've been scared to evolve. But the thoughts that I thought about you just don't work like I thought. I'm at war with myself, and I don't like how it feels. But you're asking for a miracle I don't receive. 'Cause maybe faith is a gift that I'm yet to receive. Like a house in the sand. If the wind starts to blow, I don't know how much longer I'll last. Are you finding these songs kinda hard to believe? 'Cause I'm at war with myself, and I don't know what I think. I keep asking for miracles I never see. Or maybe faith is a gift that you wasted on me. Lord, give it to me. Oh, if faith is a gift, Jesus, give it to me.
You guys are awesome. So the book of Judges is an interesting book to go to, especially after even a song like that. I mean, the song kind of pulls at some emotion. It pulls at some truth. I mean, it pulls at maybe even some of our own struggle, like lyrics like, are you finding these words hard to believe? Do you ever find that true for you? Do you ever sing songs here and you struggle to believe some of it to be true? Songs about God's goodness, God's provision, God's care. There's a song I was listening to on repeat this last week. I don't know if you ever do that. You do that, right? You get certain songs, you just get stuck. You're like, oh, this is my week song. Next week it'll be a different one. But one I had on repeat this week, it had a line in there that sang over and over again, God will never let you down. And yet I started thinking, I have a friend who just buried her husband in the last couple of weeks. And I wonder if she would question those lyrics. I wonder if she would feel like right now, I think God did let me. I wonder if she could sing those and believe it, or if she might sing lyrics like that. She might want to sing lyrics like that, but then feel like that song just said, finding it hard to believe those lyrics right now. And so there's a lot of truth in that song about the need for God to show up, about our wrestle and belief that he actually will at times. And then we're going to turn to a book like Judges. Now, I don't know, anybody read the book of Judges recently? Are you kidding me? Wow, that's like there was nobody that raised their hand in first service, so there you go, you get a badge. But like the book of Judges, so most of us know, right? It's not a book that we tend to go to. Frankly, it's a pretty difficult book. It's a difficult book to read, it's a difficult book to even teach. The book of Judges contains some of the most horrific stories in all of the Bible. You will see some of the places in the book of Judges that take account of some of the worst things that people can do to people. It's a time in history that was a little bit like the Wild West. Everybody was a law to themselves on steroids. Just a kill or be killed time in history. It's also a time that covers about 350 years of the nation of Israel in 21 chapters and 5 generations of them progressively spiraling more and more out of control and further away from God. From just doing things that are counter to his character, to sliding into things that are evil, to sliding into things that are just downright wicked and broken. Like it's a difficult book to read. Some of the things that you see in there are some of the most awful things you'll ever hear of people doing to people. This is not a book that anyone's writing kid stories on. No one's writing like bedtime Bible stories for kids. Hey, sweetheart, okay, we're going to read tonight. And then he killed 10,000 of them with the bone of an animal and piled up their bloody corpses. Sweet dreams. Like that's Judges. Like nobody's doing that from this book. So we have a tendency for books like that just to avoid it, because the book of Judges has some of the greatest amounts of violence in all of the Bible. That frankly isn't always easy to know what to do with, or how to conclude, or how to understand God in the midst of all of it. So those are parts of the Bible that we tend to just kind of close and shove to the side. We'd prefer much more to camp in places like Psalms that talk about God's never-ending love, his faithfulness that endures forever. Like, let's go read those places. So why camp in a place like Judges? Because for 3 weeks, like I said a minute ago, this is where we're going to be. So why read a book like that with so much darkness and so much wickedness? And here's why I tell you why. Because I think in many ways a book like this, in all of its difficulty, is an invitation for you and I to examine our own brokenness and our own propensity for darkness and wickedness, our own propensity to say no to God and to believe at some level or another in ourselves that we'll make better gods for our lives than God could make for our lives. This isn't a book just to simply show us 3,000 years ago what Israel did. It's to show us what today humanity, you and I, continue to do. And even more so, to show us just how good God is despite our brokenness. The book of Judges is one of those books in the Bible that, frankly, it puts on full display things like the justice and the mercy of God all together. The power and the beauty of living under his rule and his lordship in our life, and the destruction and the pain when we choose not to. And so I think the book of Judges, for all of its difficulty, is one of those kind of books that actually draws us to more deeply understand not just who God is, not just who we are, but I think many times some of the very barriers that stand in the way of us being who he made us to be, living how he made us to live, and experiencing the fullness of who he is. So Judges chapter 4, verse 1. Let me just set up who will be our main character in this account for a moment, and then we're going to pray and kind of make sense of the rest of it. Judges chapter 4, verse 1 says this. And again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord now that Ehud was dead. Ehud was a former leader, another judge. So the Lord sold him into the hands of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazar. Sisera, the commander of his army, was based in Harosheth Hagoyim. By the way, this is like varsity level church Bible words today. So I'm going to mess some of these up. Bear with me if I don't. But you know how to say church words right, or Bible words? If you don't know, you just say them really fast and really confident. And then that's the way it is. So, because he had 900 chariots fitted with iron, he cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years. But they cried out to the Lord for help. Now Deborah, a prophet, and the wife of Lapideth, was leading Israel at the time. Let me pray. Father, I just come to you this morning and ask that you would continue, as I believe you've already been doing this morning, you would continue to teach, that your voice would be loud and clear. I have tried to do my best to sit in this text for a while now and understand what you would have me to understand and what it is I think you would have us to understand this morning. But I know this, at the end of the day, I'm just trying to understand you like everybody else, God. So anything that I've even already decided to say that's not from you, I pray you take it out of my mind and erase it from all of ours. But what's from you, would it come across clear today? Would it come across loud? Would it come across compassionate? Would it come across firm? I pray, God, that you, just knowing where each of us are at, whether it's believing in you or doubting you or not sure there is a you or fully devoted to you, that you would do the thing that only you can do to personally meet us, to speak to us, to draw us in, and to make sense of what, in many regards, can be a very confusing place in the Bible for us to try to understand why in the world it's even in the Bible. And so I pray you'd do all of that. I pray you'd be the one that we hear from the most today. And it's to your glory, to your honor, Jesus Christ. Amen. And before we go any further, we are going to take up our offering this morning. And as always, just say thank you for all of your generosity, all the things we get to do. I will tell you, I don't know if you've had many experiences outside Kensington, but there are several things I think are super unique about us and about you. And I will tell you, one of them is honestly just the open-handed generosity of this place. Whether it's open-handed to tell people to go help other people plant churches, whether it's open-handed financially, whether it's open-handed with your time, saying, hey, we're going to help our community, we're going to help whatever it is. Like this is unique. I don't know if you realize that. That's not like every other church in the world. So I just want to say thank you. I think it's a group of people really leaned in to say, hey, God, how do you want us to be your people in this world? And it's not just about having a service on a Sunday morning. So everything that we do here, but mostly and most importantly outside of here, it happens because of moments like this and because of people like you. So thank you. If you're not a part of it, we'd love to have you join us on mission and on the journey. All the ways to do that are on the screen. And for those of you who are a part of it, couldn't do it without you. So, all right, before we get to Deborah and try and understand a little bit more of really the hero of our story today, there is a little bit of work we need to do to understand, I think, the first few verses that lay context, that make sense of the greater story, and I think even start to make sense of how any of this has relationship to our lives and what in the world it has to do with us. We'll start with the very first word, again. This is a word that you're going to see all throughout the book of Judges. If you go back to the previous chapter 3, you'll see the word again, followed by the same phrase we do here in chapter 4. Again, the people did evil in the eyes of the Lord. The story we're in today is found in chapter 4 and 5, kind of sum it all up. So if you skipped over to 6, you'll see the same thing. Again, the people did evil in the eyes of the Lord. This was the cycle of Israel. And the truth is, this is the cycle of us. Like, there's not a one of us that has figured out how to just perfectly follow God and never have an again moment. Like, this is humanity's struggle, is that we have these again moments. It's like, I'm following God and dang it, again, I did fill in the blank. But this is a 350-year cycle for Israel. On the screen, super simple diagram. This has been, for 5 generations, this is the cycle of Israel and what's been going on with them. Israel's walking with God. They're walking in his ways. They're living how he's asked them to live. They're living in harmony with him. They're reaping all the benefits of that. And then somewhere along the way, to some degree or another, they feel like we're missing out on what other people have, or we can make better gods for ourselves than you. We can make better ways of life than you. And they begin to deviate away from him. That's their sin. And it manifests itself in all kinds of different ways and different forms of brokenness. When that happens, they begin to suffer. Sometimes they suffer internally as a community. Sometimes they suffer because outside nations come and overtake them. There's all different ways that the suffering manifests. But the suffering is always a product of them wandering away because of their sin. At some point then, this is their cycle, they realize, what are we doing? And that sometimes it might be months, it might be years, it might be decades. But there's a point typically where they come back and they apologize. They go, God, you know what? You're God. You were right. We were wrong. What were we thinking? We want to be in step with you again. And so it's a kind of a time and a season of repentance. God steps in. He saves them. He drives out an invading nation, or he brings healing, or he sets up a new and a better leader. And then they repeat the cycle again. After a season of walking with him and reaping the benefit, then all of a sudden, boom, they're back into the cycle of sin, suffer, sorry, save. Sin, suffer, sorry, save. And they just continue to go through this cycle. There's 2 verses in the book of Judges, one near the beginning and one near the end, that really sum up this time period in the nation of Israel. Near the beginning of the book of Judges, we read a verse on your screen that simply says this: a generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Now, this verse follows early on in the book of Judges. It's in chapter 2, if you want to read it. Joshua, who followed Moses is the one that led the nation of Israel out of Egypt, led them to the promised land that they're in now to be a people of their own, living without the oppression of the Egyptian empire. Moses gets old. Moses passes on the mantle and passes away to Joshua. Joshua leads the nation very much like Moses did. He's a good leader. But after Joshua passes away, it says there's a whole generation that grows up that does not know God, nor the things he's done for Israel. There's a whole generation that is in this place of a complete lack of awareness of who God is, what he does, what he's about, because frankly, the parents of the previous generation failed to pass on the knowledge and the experience of who God was. I would contend that much of what we find ourselves, even in our world right now, is because of the same kind of dynamic. There are so many statistics about our youngest generations growing up who are leaving the church in record numbers. And this isn't to put all the blame on previous generations, but I think you do have to acknowledge that there is something of that impact that has occurred in the result of previous generations not taking up the mantle like Israel once did not take up the mantle, to pass on the knowledge and to pass on the experience of God. So you have this generation that begins to grow up. And then they have generations that continue to grow up further and further away from the knowledge of God, which is what leads us to probably the bookend verse near the end of Judges. It says this about Israel. So Israel had no king, and thus everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So as a generation continues to grow up and create their own generations and grow further and further away from God, they go further and further away from their understanding of who he is, how he is, his character, his nature, his expectations. And so what they end up doing is they end up creating a law unto themselves. Their sense of morality becomes fluid instead of fixed on the character of God, and they begin to live for what was right in their own eyes. Everyone just kind of determined what was right for them. You do you, I'll do me. But as they began to live for what was right in their own eyes, what was right in their own eyes is what ended up becoming what was evil in the eyes of God. Because what's evil versus what's good, what's right versus what's wrong, it's not just that God sat down one day and picked a list of things and went, well, I think, okay, that's good, that's bad. And he just, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, that one, I picked that one. What is good versus what is bad, what is evil versus what is righteous is directly connected to the character and the nature of God. In other words, everything that God would identify as good and right is because it is who he is. And everything that God would identify as wicked and broken and evil is because it's counter to the character and the nature of God. And so what begins to happen is as the people begin to determine for themselves what's right in their own eyes, is they start to pull away from God because they're no longer living for him and for who he expected them to be. And the consequence of that is more than just the fact that they're rejecting his ways, they're literally rejecting him. Because part of what God has expected in his relationship with the Israelites is that through his relationship with this people, like he picked a very specific people. Okay, I'm going to pick the Israelites, the Hebrew people. And through the Hebrew people, I'm going to form a relationship with them where I'm going to invite them into harmony with myself. And I'm going to invite them into my ways of living and my ways of relating, my ways of treating others and treating themselves. And then in doing that, his whole idea was to essentially paint a canvas of what his character, what his nature, and even the truth of his existence, paint that to the entire world. To be able to show to the entire world through his relationship with Israel that he existed, who he was, what he was like, and that his nature, his character, and his ways were better than anything else. That's why when Israel begins to wander away from him and do what's right in their own eyes, it wasn't simply a rejection of his ways. It was literally a rejection of God himself. It was Israel saying to God, we actually don't want you to be our Lord. We would like a different Lord. We would like somebody different to reign and rule over us. We want to be a different people. We want to experience different ways. We don't want you anymore. And so God did what God has a tendency to do with all of us, because God will never force us into obedience, never force us into relationship, is he complies. And he says, okay, if that's what you want. There's a phrase in there actually that says that he sold them over to the Canaanites, which obviously there's not like a deal being brokered. There's no money changing hands. All this literally means is that God gave them their wish. If they want to be a part of another people, if they want to have another Lord over them, if they want to experience a different way of life, then he just simply said, okay. It's very similar to what we read even in the New Testament, the book of Romans, chapter 1, where it says that God gave them over to the sinful desires of their heart. It's simply the same thing that's happening here, is that God says, if this is what you want, then I will allow it. And if you want a different king and you want a different way of life, then I give you Jabin, the king of not my people, who worship a very different God, AKA a counterfeit version of me, and who live with very different ways than I do. But if that's what you want, then I'll allow you to choose that. And the thing about Jabin is, Jabin's not just a broken king. I mean, this guy was inventing ways to be evil. He was twisted, he was wicked, he was the kind of man that if he wanted it, he just took it. He overpowered other nations, slaughtered people in the thousands. He had an army to back up whatever it is he wanted to do. They became so broken and twisted that even part of their church services involved the murder of their children. Like, this is a broken man and a broken way of life. And if you disagreed with him, you'd lose. Because not only does he have a formidable army, but as we just read, he has an army that contains 900 iron-reinforced chariots, which these are kind of like advanced of the day. Like, he's ahead of the game when it comes to military equipment. Even though Israel had quite a few men in their army, they stood no chance against it. This would be like maybe the modern day equivalent of tanks. Like, I don't know exactly how to make a good equivalent of what this would be like, but for all the people Israel had, going up against 900 armored chariots and all the men would be like sending today maybe a group of horseback soldiers to fight a bunch of M1A1 tanks. Like, you're just gonna lose. This isn't gonna work out well for you. So Jabin is not only a wicked king, he's also got the power and he has the authority and he has the might to do whatever it is that he wants to do. Carrying out all of his wishes is Sisera, the commander of his army. So Jabin rules Canaan, and he'll kind of fade a little bit into the background of the story as we go on, because who steps into the forefront is the commander of his army, who in many regards is even more wicked and more broken than Jabin, because everything Jabin wants to do, he carries it out through Sisera. He can't get anything done without the commander of his army doing it for him. So all the wickedness, all of the oppression, all of the murder, all of the pillaging, all of the violence happens under the rule and under the authority and under the command of his general. As a matter of fact, history even tells us that on top of everything else that he did, that it was probably the largest human sex ring that the world's ever known that was actually started and run under him, because of all the men, all the women, all the children that he would kidnap and then sell into sex slavery as a result of the villages that he would overthrow and that he would pillage. And for 20 years, Sisera unleashed all of his violence, all of his oppression, and all of his horror on the nation of Israel. Sometimes in our lives, the consequences that we find ourselves facing are the result of the fact that we, like Israel, have a tendency at times to turn our back on God and his ways. And then the natural consequence into our lives is the brokenness of other ways and other things over our life. Of believing even sometimes that we'll make a better God over our life than he'll make over our life. I think one of the hardest things to wrestle with, in all truth, I want to camp here for just a minute, because I think you have to deal with this in a story like this. One of the hardest things to deal with the nature of God that's really brought to the forefront in places like this is God is far more complex than we would like him to be. It'd be great if God was either one thing or another, but God is so complex, so multidimensional, that you have stories like this that you have to contend with the fact that while God is on one hand loving and merciful, and we'll see that in how he rescues Israel in a minute, he is also a God who is fully truthful and a God of justice. A God who, when we choose like Israel to say, I'm gonna do it my way, he's a God that says, okay, I'm not gonna force you into anything. And then here's where we struggle, because sometimes our lives, when we choose to do life different than him, we find ourselves in moments like Israel, just under the oppression of something else, under the oppression of an addiction, under the oppression of a relationship, under the oppression of something else or someone else in our life. They're like, this is not how I thought things would work out. We have a tendency then to blame God instead of realizing, no. These are the consequences of our decisions. You go, yeah, well, if God's loving, then why doesn't he just swoop in and rescue me from them? He does when we ask. But he doesn't when we continue to walk away from him. See, sometimes we would prefer a God who is either a God of justice and truth or a God of mercy and love. And honestly, based on your personality, we have a tendency to kind of lean one direction or the other. Like, just think for yourself for a minute. You'll know. Like, do you tend to prefer and lean more naturally based on your personality towards seeing God as just loving and merciful? Or do you tend more to lean towards seeing God first as the God of truth and the God of justice? This is one of the reasons why we need one another. Because none of us fully comprehend and get God right. My personality tends to lean naturally first more towards a God of truth and justice. I have had to learn over time to see and to grow more in my understanding of God as a God of love and as a God of mercy. But that has happened with the help of other people that tend to see him that way first and foremost. This is why we need one another. Not a single one of us gets God completely right. And so the danger in that is that we will tend to pick one version of God over the other. For those of us that tend to prefer the God of more truth and justice, you might be the kind of person that, like, you have a lot of this book memorized. You have verses memorized. You know a lot of important Christian doctrines and beliefs. You have a high value of this book. But you also tend to be the kind of person that struggles to deeply and genuinely love your neighbor. You maybe have a mind that's very sharp with spiritual matters and biblical understanding, but you also possibly tend to have a heart that's a little bit hard towards people. For people that tend to see God mostly or even only as a God of truth and justice instead of seeing all of who he is, you will, and this has been my journey, you will tend to struggle with the mercy of God. You will tend to struggle with the forgiveness of God and the compassion of God because it's truth and it's justice, and your tendency will be, well, they messed up and they need to be punished, and God would be like, well, how about you? And you're like, well, that's different. But here's the reality. I think some of us as Christians have lived that way for so long that our world has over-countered. We have overcompensated, which is why there's a tendency right now, I think, in many regards, to kind of push away the truth and the justice of God and only see him as loving and only see him as merciful. And if that's you, like, you tend to live with your heart wide open. Like, your compassion for people, your service to people is almost always on full display. But you might also tend, like Israel, to believe that you get to make up the rules, that you get to decide what's right and what's wrong, that you get to decide what's true and what's not true. You also, maybe like Israel, have a tendency to do what I like to call biblical origami, where you bend this thing in such ways that you end up just making it say what you want it to say instead of reading it for what it does say. The problem is when we side either direction on who God is. And you see both in these passages of Judges. God who is merciful and compassionate, but also a God of truth and justice. But when we choose to prefer and lean into only one or the other, here's the truth, is that you're not following after the God of the Bible, you're following after some counterfeit version that you and I have created. Amen. When we realize he is fully just and fully merciful, he is complete truth and complete love, and have a fuller understanding of who he is, it makes a lot more sense when we read stories like this of the nation of Israel, who God loves, who God wants to save, who God wants to redeem, but who God also stands back and lets them suffer when they choose something other than him. And so for 20 long years, they suffer under Jabin, and they suffer under Sisera's rule. But the second they cry out to him for help, God responds, rushes in, and sends Deborah. Go back to the text. Here's what we read. Verse 4. Actually, I'm going to read it off your screen. I'm going to use a different version. Now, Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at that time. She used to sit under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. And the people of Israel came up to her for judgment. And so she sent and summoned Barak, the son of Adonam, from Kadesh, Naphtali, told you, man, varsity level, and said to him, has not the Lord, the God of Israel, commanded you, go gather men at Mount Tabor, taking 10,000 from the people of Naphtali and the people of Zebulun, and I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army. So she's like, listen, we're going to go to battle. You get the troops ready. I'll be the bait. I'll lure him in. He's going to meet you by the river Kishon with his chariots and his troops, and I will give him into your hand. Now, a couple things that matter about this text. For one, Deborah is functioning a little bit different than your typical judge. Deborah is a judge, but the word judge is a little misleading based on the way we understand judge. This isn't like wearing a black robe and presiding over court cases. Judge typically meant in the book of Judges more of a military commander, somebody that was leading armies, somebody that was a warrior, even if they didn't have an army behind them. It was more of a fighter. Where Deborah is functioning in a different role. Chapter 5 actually gives a couple of points of indication of some of her heart and her character. Chapter 5 even describes Deborah as having a motherly heart for Israel. Part of what Deborah is doing is not necessarily leading in the same way that previous judges have as just the military commander. She's leading with a sense of empathy towards people. She wants to be in the lives of people, tangled up with people, present to people, helping them sort through their conflict, presiding over their disagreements. So she's a people of the people. Like she's for them and she's with them. But that means that she needs to have somebody that's over the army. The job of the army is to be the defensive force for the nation of Israel, protecting them from all the outside forces that would pillage them, that would raid them, that would harm them, that would murder them. So that's Barak. So she, as she's leading Israel, appoints Barak to be the leader of the army. The problem is he's not leading. That's why she goes to him and she says to him a couple of key things that indicate this isn't new news. She says, has not the Lord already commanded you? So in other words, has not commanded, those are things he's aware of. This isn't new news to Barak. What she's doing is she's confronting his cowardly, pathetic leadership that isn't stepping into his responsibility. What Barak is doing is he's enjoying all the benefits of being in a high-level position, but not executing the responsibility of it. And the reason is 900 chariots of iron. Like he realizes this is horseback versus tank. I don't stand a chance. So I'm gonna be the military commander by name only. I'm not gonna actually do it. So one of the things that Deborah first does is she confronts him. She confronts him in his self-centered, lazy, cowardly leadership. And says, listen, you know what God has called you to do. You know how he has led you already. This isn't new news. It's time for you to step into who God's made you to be and to step out into what God's made you to do. And then she says to him, and if you will now do it, she says, you're going to reap all the benefit. You haven't been faithful to do what God's called you to do yet, but even now, if you'll do it, you'll get the benefit for it. That's when she says, I will give this guy Sisera over into your hand. So she's like, I know you haven't done it yet, but if you do it now, I'll lead him to you. I'll be the bait, but I won't even get the credit for it. You'll get all the credit for it. I'll lead him into your hand. The natural response should have been, you're right. I haven't been doing what I should do. I'm going to step it up. I don't know how this is going to go, us against chariots, but you're right. I have a massive responsibility to protect these people, and I will. But instead, he tries to make a deal. So if you continue to go on in the text, here's what it says. And Barak said to her, if you go with me, then I will go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go. So essentially what he's saying is, hey, listen, you and God seem to be on good terms, so I would like you with me because I'll have more confidence if you're here. Instead of having confidence that God would be with him, he needs her to be with him. And frankly, if things go bad, who can he blame? Well, Deborah was here. Deborah did it. So it's like, listen, if you go, I'll go. But if you don't go, I'm not going. And so here's what she says back to him. Okay, well, certainly I'm going to go with you. But because of the course you are taking, in other words, because you're still acting out of fear, because you're still acting out of cowardice, because you're still not being immediately responsive to the responsibility God's given you, the honor will no longer be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh. And there Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali, and 10,000 men went under his command. And Deborah also went with him. So next several verses, you can read the rest of chapter 4 later. Next several verses, they do go to battle. It gets fierce, and Israel eventually wins. If you go over to chapter 5, it's kind of the after-battle kind of recap of what happened. And there's a couple places in chapter 5 that tell us how in the world horseback troops defeated M1A1 tanks. Verse 4 of chapter 5 says, when the Lord went out from Seir, when you marched from the land of Edom, the earth shook and the heavens poured. The clouds poured down water and the mountains quaked before the Lord. Now, if you skip over to verse 20, from the heavens the stars fought. From their courses they fought against Sisera. And the river Kishon swept them away. The age-old river Kishon, march on, my soul, be strong. Here's all that means. At some point during the battle, God unleashed the clouds and brought down the water in such heavy force, the rain came, that it overflowed the river and then flooded the valley where the battle was taking place. 900 tanks are a formidable force if you're on dry, flat, open field. But you flood that field and you make it muddy, and what was once your might becomes your liability. And so suddenly all these chariots start getting stuck in the mud. They're useless now. So 10,000 troops swoop in to where 900 chariots were, where otherwise there wouldn't have been a battle. Now there's not a battle the opposite direction. And so Israel is able to overthrow. You know, there's one of the things I think is so important. I want to pull a few things out. I want to get to a couple of the people. I'm going to pull a few things out along the way. Never assume that you know the outcome of your being obedient to something God nudges you to do. Sometimes we talk ourselves out of the things that we feel like God is nudging us to do. Maybe a nudge in our job, maybe a nudge in a relationship, maybe a nudge in a habit. And we have a tendency to conclude, well, I know how it's going to go if I do that. I know what's going to happen. I have a friend of mine that we just had a long conversation the last couple of weeks about somebody in their family that's just wreaking havoc on the family. And they know that what they need to do is they need to lay down some boundaries. But they know the minute they lay down the boundaries is what he's saying. I know what's going to happen is I'm going to be the black sheep of the family. Everyone's going to get mad at me. I'm like, well, you don't know. They're like, no, I know. Sometimes when we feel these nudges from God to do something he wants us to do, we talk ourselves out of it because we know what's going to happen if we do it. Never assume you know what's going to happen if you're obedient to what God asks you to do. We do the obeying. He does the miraculous. We say yes, he sends the rain. When you're obedient, God steps in and fights in ways that finish a battle that you couldn't finish on your own. Don't ever assume that you know what the outcome will be of your obedience. This is what's kept Barak held back for so long, because he knew what would happen. I know we'll lose. I know they'll overthrow us. I know we can't defeat 900 steel chariots. What he didn't know is that the minute that he was obedient, God would fight in a way that they couldn't fight. So they have the battle. Israel begins to overwhelm the Canaanite army. And then Sisera, once his chariot's stuck, the text tells us that he runs. And where he runs to is the house of a man named Heber, who he's the kind of head of a clan of people that have made a pact, essentially, with Canaan. And their pact is, we're not like friends, but I won't fight you and you won't fight us, so we're kind of neutral territory. So what Sisera ends up assuming is, in the battle, I've got to go find some neutral ground. So he runs to this house of this man named Heber, who has a wife named Jael. The problem is that Heber is just like Barak. This is another man who is making decisions out of cowardice, protecting his own skin. That's why he's made this agreement with a wicked people and a wicked king, and it creates division in his own home, because his wife's like, I'm not in on this. I'm not a part of supporting these people. I've seen what they've done to the Israelite nation. And so you have a story where, as it continues to go on, again, another man leading out of cowardice, whose wife is going to step in and do what needs to be done. Verse 18, Jael, this is the wife of Heber, went out to meet Sisera and said to him, come in, my lord, come in right now and do not be afraid. And so he entered her tent, and she covered him with a blanket. I'm thirsty, he said. Can you give me some water to drink? So she opened up a skin of milk and gave him a drink. And then she covered him up. Stand in the doorway of the tent, he told her. If someone comes by and asks you, is anyone there? Say no. But Jael, Heber's wife, picked up a tent peg and a hammer and went quietly to him while he lay fast asleep, exhausted. and she drove the peg through his temple into the ground, and he died. No duh. It's like, sometimes the obvious is like so obvious, like, and he died. What in the world do you take from a story like this? You've got two empires. You've got one overthrowing the other. You've got a horrific, vicious battle. You've got one nation killing their babies. You've got another that's walked away from God. You've got tent spikes and hammers and a dead man in the bedroom. Like, what in the world do you do with this story? Well, I think there's a couple things to take from a few of the people in the story. Like, really simple things. I don't want to overcomplicate this. Start with Barak, for example. Here's the lesson for Barak. Do what you're afraid to do that God nudges you towards. That's it. Do what you're afraid to do that God nudges you towards. I believe that God is constantly nudging us. He nudges us in our behavior. He nudges us in our relationships. He nudges us in how we love people. He nudges us all the time. Do it. But there are nudges that God gives to us that, honestly, some of them can bring a lot of fear. Just like Barak, and we tend to pull back because we know how this is going to go, and we know the outcome of it. But what if your courage is going to be the very means by which somebody else finds their courage? When he finally did step up, the whole nation followed him. Why didn't the nation rally and just say, okay, if you're not going to lead, we're going to go? Because they needed somebody else to take that first step. Don't sit around if you know that God's nudging you to do something and tell yourself, well, let me think about it for a while. Maybe I'll eventually get there. I don't know. Let me weigh the pros and cons. If you know God's nudging you to do something, just do it, regardless of the fear involved. Now, if you're Deborah, here'd be my very simple takeaway from her. Live your life in such a way as to be willing to confront bad leadership and broken living. The whole series, we're calling it Heroic Moments, but I think sometimes when we think of heroism, we think of the person that's going to run into the burning building, run towards conflict instead of away from conflict. We think of the William Wallace types, the sword and a battle and an army behind them. But I think sometimes the most heroic moments are the most simple moments. And I think one of the most simple moments of being a hero is when we have the courage to confront bad leadership. When we have the courage to stand up to somebody who has the ability to influence the lives of others and yet is living in a self-centered, cowardly way. Living in a way where they're more concerned about what other people are going to think or what other people could do to them than actually living out what they should do and say. And I love that Deborah has the ability to not only just confront bad leadership, but also own her own stuff. Like, to go to Barak, she has to also own the fact that she's a part of the problem too. Like, she's not a perfect individual. Which is why I think another thing to take from Deborah is not just a willingness to confront bad leadership, but it's also the willingness to look at your own brokenness inside. Like, where are you derailing? And to have the courage and the willingness with compassion and mercy to confront the people around you that you love. I think one of the lost things in the church right now is the ability for us as brothers and sisters in Christ to challenge and confront one another when it's appropriate and necessary, and to do it with compassion and mercy, but to do it. Because we live in a world where it's you do you, I'll do me. And so who am I to tell you anything? You're not. But he is, and he did. And so I would just tell you, my life would not be where it is as a follower of God if I hadn't had men and women throughout the course of my life to this present day that have taken the courage and the love to get in my face at times. And to say, hey, you're going off the rails. This isn't who God's called you to be. And I've had some that have done it like a complete jerk at times. That's not who we're called to be. But I do think one of the things that Deborah exhibits is the ability to go to her people she loves and cares about, and challenge them to be who God called and made them to be. And then there's Jael. I don't think we can get away from the passage without her story. Let me give you what I think is the lesson from Jael and then tell you why real quick. The lesson from Jael is be consistent in the monotonous. Be consistent in the monotonous. Verse 17 tells us a little bit about who she is. Sisera, meanwhile, fled on foot to the tent of Jael. This is an important detail. It doesn't say to the tent of Heber, her husband. We're living in a patriarchal community and society, so everything usually channels first through the name of the man. So it tells you something when anything channels first through the name of the woman or the wife. So this is her tent, the tent of Jael. And one more detail over in chapter 5, verse 24. Most blessed of women by BJL, the wife of Heber the Kenite, most blessed, this is a detail, of tent-dwelling women. Here's what we know about the Kenite people who she's a part of. They're nomads, they're travelers, which means they're constantly in a habit of setting up camp, tearing down camp, setting up camp, tearing down camp, setting up camp, tearing down camp, setting up. You get the idea? This is what they do. This is how they live. They don't have a permanent zip code and address. They're just constantly on the move. One commentator, in explaining what that meant for a wife of this era, particularly when the phrasing is used that it's her tent, one commentator says it this way. He says the description of a woman in this role was to explain that it was her responsibility to mind the business of the family. And it may have even been to respect the manly actions she performed in her tent, equal to, if not even superior to what was done in the field by her husband. And then if you look at some of the, like even today, you look at some of the nomad peoples around our world, like in Somalia, presently in Africa, you can witness this same dynamic happening in nomad homes with the women and with the men. And this is noted about even right now, Somali groups that travel and live in the same way. All the work rests on the women. The care, the education of infants, maintenance of the house, preparation of food, cutting of wood, supply of water, and listen to this, and the construction of the house are in her department. Okay, here's why all that matters. That means for a nomad people, the home was her responsibility, the construction of it. What's the construction of a nomad's home? It's a tent. How do you hold up a tent? With pegs. Which means that she knew how to hammer a peg into the ground because she did it over and over and over and over and over and over again as a part of her life. Years ago, my family, my wife's side, we all got together for like this barbecue in the summer, and we did this game. You ever done this where you get a 2x4 of wood or a 4x4, and you put a bunch of nails in it, you see who can hammer the nail in with the least amount of hits? So I was leading the pack. It was one more guy to go. I think I had like 3 hits, and I got it in. And then my wife's cousin, Harvey, stepped up. He's like, my turn. Well, Harvey's a framer. And Harvey grabs his hammer, and he just goes, bam! And I was out. He's like, and I'm like, dude. He goes, it's what I do. I'm like, clearly. You get the sense of the way the story goes in which he came to him that it was just a bam. Drove it in, he was done. There was no fight to be had, and Israel was now free. Why? Because this was a behavior that she had had to do over and over and over and over again. There is something in your life right now that God has given you responsibility to do that feels monotonous. And maybe it's your marriage. Maybe it's just in a really weird place where it just feels like over and over and over again, I'm trying to, and we're in the same place. Or maybe it's parenting, where it's like you love your kids, but they're just at that young age where it is just Groundhog's Day every single day. It's just over and over and over. You're saying the same things. You're going through the same routine. Maybe it's your job. I have a friend that just came back from a couple of months in rehab, trying to kick an addiction. And I know a lot of his behavior going forward in the next number of years is going to feel very monotonous. It's going to be the say no over and over and over and over again. Listen, here's a point. What if whatever is the monotonous in your life right now will be the means by which God, in his perfect plan and in his perfect time, will provide the miracle that you need or someone else needs through you? So stay consistent with the monotonous. This whole story, in one regard or another, is really about fear. There's the fear of missing out with Israel. Well, we want what they have. What if God really isn't better? And we're afraid they may have it better. There's the fear of Barak. If I step into what God wants, this could cost me. There was the fear, at least for some period of time, of even Deborah. until she had the courage to finally go speak to Barak, to confront him, to challenge him. There's the fear of what happens when we go up against an opposing army. There could have been the fear of Jael, of what if I let this man live? What if he comes back to our name? There's all kinds of fear that overwhelmed these people. Part of what had to happen was they had to step out of their fear and into their confidence that God was, and God was good, and God was in control, and God would fight all of their battles. But all of that was on the other side of them facing their fear and stepping in not to their courage, but into God's character, which gave them courage. So stand with me, would you? And let's sing this last song as we end today, not so much as a song, but as a request that God would make us such brave people. All right, don't forget, we would love to have you come outside, see what we're dreaming about, what we're developing out there. Also, we've got a prayer team. Some of them will be down here at the front, and some are out in the lobby. If we could just pray for you, pray with you, or even just sit and listen for a little bit before you go home today, if that would serve you, we would love to do that. Otherwise, next week, we're going to take on Samson, continue the series. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you next Sunday.
Hey, I don't know about you, but I thought that was a really powerful service. I talked to a couple people that have just begun to walk out, and basically their takeaway is God has a plan. And sometimes we need to step into that plan and even step into uncomfortable things. And I think it's all within us. It's just getting the courage to do it.
Yes.
What'd you think?
I thought it was pretty awesome.
Yeah, good.
That God will, His plan will happen whether you want to participate or not. But it's better. You get the blessings when you participate.
For sure. You guys, we're so happy you joined us today, and we look forward to seeing you again next week. We've got party in the green space on July 30th, and we also would love to have you come back for August baptisms, August 2nd, during midweek services. Thanks, everybody. Have a good week.